Hello! I have just read Chapter 9 of The Last of the Jedi Return of the Dark Side. So, Trevor is running from crystal formation to crystal formation. And he's thinking, well, at least they aren't shooting at me. And then that's when one of them shoots at him and he goes, scratch that. Um, he's running out of crystal formations to jump to. Not to mention that they're like sharp needles, and every time he has to put, and he's struggling to get a grip on there because it just can't find footing, and they're like sharp needles. And Trevor's running out of room. One of the speeders has a little crash and spins out. The other one's shooting at him. They keeps coming for him. And that's when the mystery speeder, the silver one, comes over to him, and he's just run out of formations, and it starts going up the crystal, and Trevor jumps in, and then he lands in awkwardly with one leg out, and um, the mystery pilot pulls Trevor in, and does a hard turn to the starboard, and they start speeding away, and they eventually lose the Imperials, and eventually they come over to a red ship with a chromium hull, parked under a canopy of crystals. And the mystery pilot, which Trevor very quickly realised in about 10 seconds, that, oh, this is a very capable pilot. She introduced... now, what's the conversation, actually? I just went back too far. Oh, during the entire chase, though, Trevor's thinking this is like the pod races Ferris told him about. But anyway, once they come to a stop at the as a cruiser, at a ship or whatever. Yeah, it just says vehicle, a sleek ship. He says that was one galactic ride. And Trevor says, "You're Flame, aren't you?" And she says, "Who wants to know?" And Trevor explains that Thomas sent him, and Flames goes, "You're a bit young, aren't you?" And Trevor is a bit annoyed and ignores the comment, and he explains that he's Trevor Flume from the Resistance and Balasa. And when she asks how he got with Toma, he said that he explains that they share an Imperial eye down, he's got a death mark on his head, and he's trying not to sound boastful. And he's... Oh! Sorry, just almost lost my bookmark then. And he explains that he's been travelling with Ferris Olin. And we learn that Flame's been trying to get into contact with Ferris, and it says that he's disappeared from, and then Trevor tells her that Toma told him that she's trying to make a network for resistance movements in the core worlds, and and Flame says it's a start. They're not going to get anywhere if they're not organised. And she says, "I've learned one thing in my life. Great wealth makes things happen. If we can fund resistance movements through one central organisation, we can make progress. All it takes is wealth. Wealth creates opportunity. Simple." And Trevor again says that Toma told me you were one of the wealthiest citizens of Nakarin. And she says that she was loaded, but now she's only got a bit stashed here and there. Quite a bit stashed, and she's looking for more investors. And it's not only the freedom fighters that are fighting the Empire, it's business people as well, because, again, there's not going to be anyone buying if people are scared. And Trevor says, "So which are you, a freedom fighter or just interested in your wealth?" And Flame says, "Why not? What's the matter with both? I'm a realist dreamer. Most beings aren't idealists. Most want to know what's in it for them." And Trevor says, "You're speaking my language." And Flame asks if Trevor can bring him up with Feather Solon, and Trevor explains that's why he's here, and Soma thinks that they may have been able to help each other. And Flame asks what's Toma's deal and what he's trying to do, and of course Trevor can't disclose about the secret Jedi base, but he says that since he's been with him, he's basically been trying to escape from Imperial jails, and that he'll have to ask Toma that question. And Flame starts explaining her mission, and says that she's got an idea to help the Resistance here. And and she says, what makes Samaria unique aside from this place? And she says, the personal droids. Everyone has them, including the Imperial Advisor. They gave him one to thank him for saving the city. And Trevor says he didn't save the city, he just took the credit. And Flame says it doesn't matter. But that droid's tracking it there his every move. If she can get that droid, she can tell the Resistance she means business. She says it won't be easy to steal it, but then Trevor interrupts and says, but it will be for me. And that's where we end off the chapter. Again, Trevor is Trevor. You know, he's got all the humour going on. And I'm also officially now over halfway through the book. Again, I only started it 2 days ago, so that's good going. In fact, I was going through it so fast that just before I read this chapter, I had to go and skim through each of the chapters. I look at the start of each chapter just to make sure I memorised the order of the chapters correctly, because I wasn't sure if I remembered them in the correct order, but I had. But anyway, it's going to be interesting to see what goes on with Flame now, because again she's wanting to take the droid, but then of course you got the Samarian Resistance who are wanting to get the footage from the droid, so it's going to be interesting to see how that conflict goes on, because I assume that won't end very well. Again, I'll just assume it won't end very well, but it definitely sounds like that's not going to work out well. So it's going to be interesting to see how that goes. Again, Trevor is funny. He likes, you know how Trevor is. He likes to inflate his importance without trying to be boastful. You know, he likes to, when I say inflate his importance, you know, he wants to be treated as an adult. You know, that's what I mean by inflate his importance. And of course, he's got his quips, which were at the start of the chapter where he's talking about, where he's thinking about them shooting at him, and he says, "At least they aren't shooting at me." Suddenly, a large hunk of crystal next to him fused into white heat and disappeared. Scratch that. Again, it's going to be, again, Flame. It's nice to see that again. One thing I think these books have done quite well is that they're not just sticking to like stereotypes, you know. Flame isn't just resisting, you know, she's also interested in her wealth. You know, well, say stereotypes, you know what I mean, just archetypes of words, sorry. You know, Flame isn't just interested in resisting the Empire, she's also interested in her wealth. Solace, you know, she's not the typical Jedi, she's a bit more... she's quite a serious character, and so that's one thing I think these books have done quite well. They don't treat the characters as if they are collectively one thing, they make them quite unique. So yeah, again, I don't know if I have anything else to say on this chapter really. It was nice to actually get reminded about what Flame's cause was, because I know she was working for a network, she was trying to make a network, but you know, it kind of slipped my mind a little bit. So you know, it was great to go, oh right, okay, yeah, that's why she's here, because for some reason I kind of forgot but didn't at the same time, if you know what I mean. So yeah, anyway, I think that will do it for this review, so thank you all for watching, and goodbye. Hello everyone. I have just read Chapter 10 of The Last of the Jedi, Return of the Dark Side. I've just gone back a little bit too far. There we go. So Ferrus is reporting to Palpatine about how he's found the Resistance and how they're considering his offer. And Palpatine asks if they will accept it, and Ferrus says Ferrus knows they won't accept it, but he needs to keep Palpatine. He needs to keep Palpatine happy, and Vader away. And he says he thinks there's a slim chance, and he has his heart in that the majority of Solarians don't really support the Resistance, and they feel isolated and don't get the sense of it, and he doesn't get the sense of very many of them. And he says, they don't trust me, of course, even though they do, but of course he needs to keep Palpatine in the dark about that. And Palpatine tells him to continue monitoring the situation, and he asks if there was any information he gained that could be helpful to Vader, and he says just a drop, and he explains that it was the speeder place, and he says they're probably going to be moving anyway now. And he says that he hasn't told Vader about it because his orders were to report to him first, and Palpatine said he will inform Vader, and that he's done well, and that's when Ferrus says Vader isn't happy that he's reporting directly to Palpatine, and Palpatine says it's not for him to be concerned with, and Ferrus says that they don't work well together, and if he knew a bit more about Vader. And that's when Palpatine goes, so you're interested in who Vader is, in the mystery of Vader, and Ferrus says everyone's interested in the mystery of Vader. And Palpatine says Vader prefers mystery and it is helpful, and he says you have something else, uniqueness. You were trained in the Force and you rejected it. All the Jedi have been eliminated, but the Force remains. You could use it again. And Ferrus says he's a bit rusty, and he knows Palpatine thinks he's corruptible. And Palpatine says he managed to find a lightsaber, and Ferrus then says that he managed to. He says that there were lots of weapons for sale after the Clone Wars, and he managed to get his hands on one. He says it's a dangerous galaxy out there. And that's when Palpatine begins the bribing and manipulation. He says, you could, I'm going to quite literally quote here from the book, you could get more power than any officer. More power, Palpatine rasps, than even Lord Vader himself. Here it was, the beginning. I'm not interested in power, Ferrus said. Everyone is interested in power, Palpatine said. But not everyone has the vision to see what real power can accomplish. Ferrus starts resting his hand on Gavin Mulan's lightsaber that he gave to him, and he thinks that the Jedi hasn't been about power. They had used the Force to bring justice to the galaxy, but it was a tough concept for even the Padawans. It was a tough concept for the Padawans. It was, as it says. And many Padawans wrestled with the concept of it. No, but in the truth, the Force gave them great power, and many Padawans wrestled with the concept of it. When to use it, when to retreat, when to advance, when to demolish an enemy, and when to let them go. It was a constant struggle. And we learn that there were many things that every Padawan would occasionally want to ask, eventually, it's something that no Padawan would admit to, because even to each other, because they worry that a whisper might bring the dark side too close, and it was that power felt good. And Ferrus, no, Ferrus, not Ferrus. Who's Ferrus? And we learn that Ferrus had fought against the feeling, and he thought he conquered it, but he had sorts of his doubts as to whether he had. And he remembers how he once brought it up with Siri, and he remembers now one of the things he loved about being with Siri was that he could ask her anything, and it wouldn't shock or disappoint her. And he starts thinking back to a memory he has of her, where he admits how he took joy in a raid they did, or in an attack or whatever. And he asks if it was wrong, and how it made him feel happy. And Siri says, well, she raised herself on her elbows. Sunlight picked out bright individual strands in her blonde hair, which she'd recently cropped even shorter than usual. Yes, she said. It is wrong to attach emotion in a battle. It is wrong to feel pleasure when an enemy falls. A Jedi should feel regret. Regrets that a life has been taken. Regrets that a physical battle had to be fought at all. But the Force gives us great gifts, Ferrus. It isn't wrong to take pleasure in your gifts, in your own gifts. To take pleasure in your mastery of skill. It is a struggle for every Jedi to retain balance, sometimes even for Jedi Masters. And she points to Mace Windu for it as an example, saying that what does Ferrus know about his lightsaber form 7 for Pard? And he says that only the best fighters can control it, because the Pard is a very tough thing to master. It brings you close to the dark side. And so he goes, exactly. It can bring you close to the dark side, to what the Sith focus on. But Mace Windu can control it. And he's saying that, and she says that her point is that even Mace Windu must acknowledge this danger of the pleasure in power. And so that's the only way he can dismiss it. In other words, my perpetually worried Padawan remembers the rare, genuine, gentle smile, not mischievous or mocking, that Siri gave, and she finishes off saying, the fact that you ask the question guards you against the dangers of it. And Ferrus thinks how it would have been such a typical Jedi response that if you are aware of a problem, you're already taking the first steps to eliminating it. And he thinks how helpful it was at the time. That was at a time where he had a temple to go to, masters around him, and he had all that careful study and rules to follow that answers his every doubt. And he starts thinking, was leaving the Jedi a relief in a way, because he never had to think about that again? Why was he thinking about it now? And even though the questions and the memory only took about a flash of a moment, he's starting to worry he took too long to answer to Palpatine, and he says that it's an interesting conversation, but he has some duties to take out of. And in fact, he's afraid that it's been taking too long to answer Palpatine, because he wonders if Palpatine has somehow already knows what he's thinking. And he says, it's been an interesting conversation, but I have some duties to take care of. And Palpatine goes, of course. And Ferrus feels the lightsaber again, and he runs it through the worn grooves, and he starts to think about Gavin Mullen, and how he had given it to him. And the last couple lines are, with that gift came responsibility, and also a connection to the way things used to be, when he had the whole Jedi Order to lean on, before he was alone. Give me your certainty, Gavin, he thought. Give me your courage. And that's how we end off the chapter. This is actually quite an interesting chapter. You can kind of see how Ferrus is being tempted by the power that Palpatine is proposing. He's rejecting it, but you can kind of see how it's a little bit tempted. You know he's just a little bit tempted. He's definitely not fully tempted. But he's a little bit tempted. And it's starting to have his doubts again. The doubts that will be answered by just the Jedi, you know. And hold on, I'm going to quickly get the... So, sorry, what was I saying? That, again, you can see how Ferrus is a little bit tempted by the power. He's not incredibly tempted. He's not being ridiculously tempted, but he's a little bit tempted. And I have a feeling that if he wasn't tempted, he wouldn't have looked back on that memory with Siri. And again, it does kind of make it clear he is a bit tempted, because power felt good. And I do wonder how that will develop Ferris's character? Is he going to be winding up really start going into denial about being temptable, and he winds up getting corrupted without realising he's being corrupted? It's going to be interesting to see where this leads his character, because Palpatine's just laid those seeds of doubts for him. It's going to be interesting to see just how that goes. Because again, he's saying that everyone's interested in power, but not everyone has the vision to use it. You know, Palpatine, he's such a great manipulator. He's flattering Ferris. You know, he's implying that Ferris, who, keep in mind, Ferris is quite intelligent. He will catch things. You know, he says that not everyone has the power to know how, but not everyone has the vision to know how to use real power. He's in a way, he's saying that Ferris is someone who would know how to use real power. To see what it was, but not everyone has the vision to see what real power can accomplish. That's what it was. And it's again, this is quite an interesting chapter, and I like how we've had another flashback to Siri, because we haven't really had that since Underworld. Okay, no way it's been since Underworld. No way it's been since Underworld since we last had our last flashback to Siri. No way. No way. But also that lesson with Siri, you know, I think that's quite I'm going to say profound lesson, because even though it is a very simple lesson, you know, no, you're already doubting it. That's the first steps to knowing that, you know. And while it is a very simple lesson, I think that's quite a good and powerful lesson, because it's, of course, if you're already doubting it, you're already taking the first steps to knowing to overcoming it. But I think that's something we don't always think of, and I think it's a very good lesson, that. Again, even though it's a very simple lesson, and even though Ferris knows it's a very Jedi lesson, you know. But I think it was quite a good lesson, and again, it's something that I think some of us need to hear sometimes, and I think that was quite a good lesson. Again, though, with Ferris, it's going to be interesting to see how that leads with the corruption of power, you know. He says he's not interested in power, but there is that little bit deep inside him, you know, there is that small bit deep inside him that wants that little bit of power, but he's trying to resist it. And, you know, it's even thinking that, what was the line? Was leaving the Jedi a relief in a way, because he never had to think about that again? You know, he's starting to wonder, is the Jedi was following the Jedi rules, you know, was that hindering him? You know, it's really bringing Ferris a lot of questions, and it's going to be interesting to see how that progresses. So, yeah. Anyway, I guess I'm going to leave this video off here, so thank you all for watching, and goodbye. Hello everyone, I've just read chapter 11 of The Last of the Jedi Return to the Dark Side. Return of the Dark Side, sorry, I keep saying Return to the Dark Side, but it's of the Dark Side. This chapter pretty much is just proving how pretty much all the Imperial officers are just the same, because Bog is thinking, he's just had a workout and he's thinking about how he doesn't need Sorrow anymore, and that Sorrow thought him a fool, but he was wrong, yada yada yada. And he's also thinking about how he doesn't trust anyone who doesn't take care of themselves. And he's told that Stano Sorrow's trying to reach him by his assistant, who's on the comlink, and says he'll contact him shortly. And his assistant says, he won't like that. And Bog says, no, he won't. And again he thinks about how Sorrow had been helpful, and how everyone thought he was the brains behind Bog. And while it is true, he got him back into a position of influence, Bog is just tired of Sorrow thinking he's in control. And he says, and now that's Sorrow's big idea, the True Justice ship, that political prisoners in space have been hijacked. He's been censured by the Emperor. A little distance would be a good idea right about now, until Bog figures out if Sorrow was out of the loop complete permanently or not. And he thinks, in the meantime, let him sweat. And again, he likes working out to makes his mind a bit sharper. And he's thinking how the Emperor himself had come to Sath, and he doesn't think he's exaggerating, and he thinks it has a little bit to do with him, which is really just a moment where it's, Bog is just fantasising here. And he thinks he's making his mark, and he thinks that nobody's ever believed in him, not his wife, not his father, but he's always believed in his destiny. And he thinks about Astrid, and he frowns at the idea of her because she never lived up to what she was meant to be in his mind. And even then, he never expected love from her. He expected a partnership. He thought, it was in his mind she was more of a tool. Thinking and he thinks he was a politician. It helped to have a pretty wife. And now he thinks that now she's gone, disappears, and that it didn't look right that he doesn't have the contact with his son Loon. But he thinks he'll find Loon one day, and he thinks when he's the ruler of Samaria, he'd have much more muscle. And he makes a little joke about one of his workout things, thinking, and he wouldn't need a vibrotonic or muscle trainer to exercise it either. And he's pleased at his own joke. And he's thinking about how the vote of no confidence for Aaron Larker is... He thinks the vote of no confidence will be a lock, which I assume just means it's secured. And he's made sure of it, and he thinks that a little bit of insurance might not be a bad idea. Something to boost his popularity with the population. So when he something to boost him when he becomes the ruler of Samaria, and so the transition between rulers will be smooth. And he starts thinking about how Samaria can be just the first step, and why he can't just take over the entire Lamersu system and move on from there. He starts thinking how this is his moment, he doesn't need Sorrow's advice, he doesn't need anyone's advice, and he's ready to strike out on his own and take the chance. And his assistant tells him Sorrow is waiting, and he says that, and he says to his assistant to tell him he's busy. And he derives a lot of pleasure from the idea of infuriating Sorrow through making him wait. And he puts his little droid on his shoulder, and he thinks how Sorrow has taught Bog well, and this is the last time this is the last time. Sorrow had taught Bog well. To control a population, one must create an enemy, something for them to be afraid of, then save them from it. It was as simple as that. It's interesting to see how Bog and Sorrow and even Malorum, to an extent, are pretty much all the same. They're all just trying to get power for themselves. I say Malorum to an extent because, Malorum he was playing it slow, he was being quite crafty, whereas Sorrow and Bog are kind of going straight to the heart, whereas Malorum's playing it smart, slowly making his way through. You just see how much of a fool Bog Davinian is in this chapter. At least he's one of the Imperials who has a sense of humour, Not the greatest sense of humour, but yeah, it's a sense of humour. But But you really just see how much of a fool Bug is in this chapter, you know. He thinks he's gaining lots of power, he thinks he'll be gaining favour with Palpatine, and he thinks how Palpatine's here partly because of him, and it's... No, he's not here partly because of you. But we know so much more than Bug knows, and that's what makes this so funny, you know. It's Bug thinks he's so much more than he actually is, and this chapter really just highlights how much Bug is not as influential as he thinks he is, you know. So it was quite interesting and funny chapter. Apparently Sorrow doesn't appear in this book, which is a bit of a shame. I know he appears in, I think, the next one. I think, was it Against the Empire? No, that's not chapter 8, book 8, I think, isn't it? Well, I think it was Secret Weapon. I could be wrong on that. Unlike the first 5 books of Last of the Jedi, I don't remember the names of the other half. So, for the other 5 books, so I'm sorry. I know there's Against the Empire, Reckoning, and Return of the Dark Side, but I think the other one is Master of Deception, and again, I think that the other one is Secret Weapon. But again, I can't remember, but again, I'm not entirely sure if Master of Deception and Secret Weapon are that. Anyway, going a bit off topic here. I enjoy this chapter, and you really just see how much of a fool Bog is. But you also kind of see how much ambition Bog has as well. You know, he keeps on setting his sights on the future. And it does make you think, is he also planning to take over Palpatine's position? Is he trying to become Emperor himself? Because he's wanting to branch out to the Mer2 system and then branch out even further from there. So it's, you know, it's interesting to see how far Bog's ambition will go. So yeah, I think that brings this review to an end. It's getting a bit of a shorter one, but yeah, thank you all for watching, and goodbye. Hello everyone, I have just read chapter 12 of The Last of the Jedi: Return of the Dark Side. So, there we go. So, Ferris is pushing back the thought of who Vader is to the back of his mind, because he knows it'll be impossible to figure out unless Vader makes a verbal slip or he somehow finds out some information about Vader. And he thinks he wouldn't be able to discover it, he might never know. And he's wondering what he's still even doing here anyway. Because even though he's kept his eyes open, he's learned almost nothing about. He's not learned a lot about the Empire, and Ferris has contacted the Resistance, but he's even not sure how he can help them. And it says there were times that he felt he was doing absolutely the right thing for absolutely the right reasons. This was not one of those times. And he thinks about how he had been a reluctant hero on Belasa and how he fought in the Clone Wars briefly, but he hasn't been a great general like Obi-Wan, and he hasn't adapted well to the army at all. And how he had fought side by side by Rome, but he hasn't been like the others who joined for adventure, as he'd seen adventure during his time as a Jedi. And he also had seen death, destruction and greed, and he had no illusions about how thrilling great battles were, because he knew the reality. Great battles were hard and bloody, and you never got the smell of it off you. And he's thinking about how he may not even be great as a double agent either, and he hoped to learn more about the Empire's plans, but he didn't really learn any. He didn't really learn that much, and he hoped that getting close to Palpatine and Vader would afford him opportunities to discover more Jedi that were known to be alive or held prisoner, but you could see that although it appears that Palpatine had confidence in him, he just wasn't really giving him access to anything that might help him at the moment, and he thinks he can observe all he wants, but what he was able to observe was carefully controlled, and he was sure it was controlled by Vader. And he wonders if they would ever let him in. And even though the city of Sath is running smoothly with no fears of the Empire raiding it first feels uneasy, you know, that he can't see any battalions, and he's found no evidence of a battalion, and he knows if Bog lost the vote, Vader would need muscle. And he's curious as to why Palpatine had any interest in Samaria in the first place, and why he brought Vader here in the first place. And we learn that he just wants to go back to his little asteroid, spend some time with Rome, just a couple of days, and see how much progress Reyna and Toma has made. Which again, we know they didn't make a lot of progress. But he also wanted to enlist Clive. But anyway, he starts making his way through the Twilight Fountains. And it's misspelt here on page 83 as Som Aria rather than Sam Aria. And he felt like there's something sucking at his footsteps and draining him, and he knows it wasn't the plight of the planet, but he wonders, is it the fact he can't see his path clearly? And he keeps going, and he's learning nothing but except having the impulse to flee Samaria. And again, the possibility of Vader being a fallen Jedi just chills him, and he keeps wondering what it is, and then he hears the voice of Nek, who says, "Ferris, follow me." And once there is no one watching, he goes over to a wall where she has a perch where she perches on top of it, and she can see the entire plaza, and there's a quick escape route if there's anyone on their tail. And Nek explains that they got some trouble and that they've been monitoring Bog's activities through his BD and got some evidence of bribery. And then she says that there's something else. The personal droid has been linked up with 2 Russian prowlers, and Ferris goes, "Aren't they illegal on Samaria?" And she says, "Yes, he must have smuggled them in." And Ferris wonders why he's done that. And Nek says that maybe he's going to do something and blame it on the Russians. That's what we fear. And Ferris asks what it is, and Nek doesn't know, but she asks him if he can go and investigate it. And he asks where, if Nek knows where Bog is. Nek says that he's in the government district. There we go. I got there eventually. In the residence tower, meeting with the Russian delegation. And Ferris makes his way over there quickly, and even gets an air taxi to take him there in less than 5 minutes. And eventually he makes his way to the meeting room, and Bog's personal aide, Nancy, give me a moment. Sorry about that, I'm back now. So, as Ferris was actually getting in, I forgot to mention, but as Ferris gets in the building, he thinks how having been a double agent sometimes has its uses, but anyway, he breaks into the little conference room, what was it referred to? The meeting room, that's what it was, with a landing platform there as well. And Ferris sneaks in, and Bog Davinian's personal aide, Nancy, sees him, but she knows he's a favourite of Palpatine's, and so doesn't mention anything, and lets him do his stuff. And that's when we hear Bog's conversation with the Russian delegation. And he's saying, "So you see, even though I oppose the trade agreement, I don't oppose an alliance with Russia, should I be elected." And Robin Starks says that you've been spreading misinformation about us to the people of South, and now they distrust us. And Bog starts to say whether or not you had anything to do with the sabotage of the Platform 7 computer, and Robin just says, "No." And Ferris admires admires his tone, how he doesn't raise his voice, but his authority even silences Bog. And he says, "We had nothing to do with the sabotage, and you know it. We are alone here, Advisor Davinian. Let's speak with honesty." And Boggs says, of course, I'm a straight shooter, always have been. And that's when Robin says that you oppose the trade agreement for your own reasons. They have nothing to do with the well-being of the two planets. So let's discuss how. Let's discuss how we could work together. You said you wanted to find a compromise, and Boggs says that's why he's here, and he says let's find some common ground, and he has a proposition for them, and he wants them to go into his speeder, which he has outside, because he says that for a bit of extra privacy, because they can never be too sure in meeting rooms. And they start making their way over there, as Robin Sark seems to have some like a telepathic conference with the 4 other members there with him, or the Russian delegation, and they agree. And Ferris follows closely behind as they walk out to the landing platform. And there's a lot of, and of course, the buildings are gleaming in the heat, and their outlines are wavy and indistinct, and that's when Ferris looks up and realises that there's a glint in the air above, and it's actually the Roshan droids. And he remembers how Aaron Larker told them that their droids are among the smallest in the galaxy with the most sophisticated systems. And Bog doesn't, and there's also an airspeeder flying down towards them, which he didn't quite see at first, which Ferris didn't quite see at first. And Bog doesn't seem to notice any of it. He's just fiddling with the PD on his shoulder, and that's when Ferris says to watch out, and that's when the airspeeder comes, not slowing down. Then it comes to a dead spot. A black figure with a hood grabs Bog's PD droid, and they sets off again. And that's when Ferris immediately begins pursuit as the stormtroopers start opening fire. And the pilots in there is very good. They're very good. Ferris takes note of how good they are. And how the little Russian droids as well have incredibly accurate aim, and it always surprised Ferris when they missed. They seem to have accurate aim. And he's incredibly impressed by the pilot's skills, and he's wondering who it is, and he thinks he has to admire it, and he wonders who it is, and he knows it can't be the Resistance because of course the Resistance need the droids to be with Bog. And he's wondering who it is and wonders who it can be, and of course we know who it is and we know who it can be. It's Flame and Trevor, and the next chapters will actually take place from their perspective. It continues from their perspective, sorry. This chapter, you really just get to see Ferris's longing. You really just see how he wants to be with Roan, how he doesn't really know why he's staying on Samaria. You know, he doesn't feel like he can be of much help, even though he wants to be of help. And how being a double agent for the Empire really hasn't done him any favours, for the most part, you know. And he just really wants to get off Samaria, and he has an impulse to get off Samaria. That's screaming at him to get off. So it's going to be interesting to see if he winds up giving in to that impulse. Now, I did accidentally come across something on Wikipedia when I was looking at Robin Sark's page, and I find out that he does die, and that Order 37 is used against the Russians, which is a bit another spoiler, and it really does feel like it's. But one thing I do like about this chapter, one thing that does seem like Order 37 is going to seem like, is that it does remind me quite a bit of Darth Plagueis. And I know this book came out quite a couple of years before Darth Plagueis. I think it was like 2006, 2007, 2000. I think it was 2006. I think December 2006. I could be wrong on that, but I think this book came out around about then. So you know, that was about 6 years before Darth Plagueis. But you know, reading Darth Plagueis first and then going into this. It does give me like a lot of, this chapter did give me quite a bit of a Darth Plagueis feel with the meeting with Bog and the Russian delegation. Again, you just see how Bog's a bit of a fool, you know, he's trying to uphold the fact that, hey, we've sabotaged the computers while knowing it's completely false, and Robin knows it's completely false. He knows Bog knows, and he knows that Bog is just putting on this facade, and it's just be honest, Bog. What else is there? What else? It's going to be interesting to see why Bog has those prowler droids, you know. That's what Ferris went there for. So it's going to be interesting to see what those Russian prowler droids are for, given they are illegal on Somalia. But yeah, I think a lot of it, main thing I have to talk about is maybe just how Ferris is feeling, you know. He expected to learn so much and he just hasn't. Roan, he just wants to spend a couple of days with Roan, away from everything. You really just understand how Ferris is feeling, and you really do just want to make everything better for him. So yeah, and it's going to be interesting to see what he says when he sees Trevor with Flame, you know. That's going to be a really fun interaction to see play out. So yeah, thank you all. I guess I'm going to end this video here, given there is quite a lot in this chapter, but you know, not a whole lot for me to really talk about for some reasons. But yeah, thank you all for watching, and goodbye. Hello everyone, I have just read chapter 13 of The Master of the Jedi Return of the Dark Side. I'm reading through this book so fast, I'm actually struggling to keep up with it. Because sometimes it's reading through it so fast, I'm struggling to remember what's happened, or I'm struggling to keep up with what's being said. Anyway. There we go. So, Flame is flying through, of course, as traffic. And Trevor say you can slow down now. The stormtroopers are falling behind, and Flame says you don't slow down until you're home free. And he says they aren't giving up. They're trying to make you think they're giving up. And she says she'll drop him down somewhere with the droids, and they can meet up later. And she can lose. And then he says you can lose the speeders a lot easier on foot. And Trevor goes, "Drop me? I don't like the sound of that." And Flame says not to worry, and he'll get him down, and she'll get him down with one piece. And she compliments Trevor getting the droid, and when eventually they fly down to a courtyard, and she hands Trevor a blaster, and Trevor jumps down, and Ferris, we see that moment and we see this whole conversation from Ferris's perspective and the dive down, and Ferris lands on the landing platform up above, and leaps down, and he doesn't know who the thief who left the ship is. He knows he doesn't know if there's a man, if they're a man or a woman. He just knows that they was slight and could run fast. And as he jumped down, you barely got a glimpse of them before the thief disappeared into the parking hangar. And he starts to hear footsteps, and he runs in, leaping over speeders. And then that's when Trevor opens fire on Ferris. And then he realises it's Ferris, and he goes, "Ferris, don't!" And Ferris has a split second to react. And instead of deflecting the bolts, he somersaults over them and lands over the last speeder and onto the ground. And he goes, "Trevor?" And beating Trevor, he makes a quip and says, "You know, you're pretty good with that thing. A guy could get killed." And Ferris asks what he's doing furiously. And he had almost killed Trevor. He almost deflected the bolts right back at him. And he swipes the idea, well, not the idea, the thoughts of Trevor being on the ground lifeless out of his mind, and he thinks, acknowledge the mistake and move on. Or, as Siri used to say, there's always time to kick yourself later. And he asks what Trevor has been doing. And Trevor says that he's helping the resistance. And then Ferris is going, I don't think so. Who was driving that speeder? And Trevor explains Flame, and so we're told said that he was in contact with her. Ferris asks who Flame is, and he says, never mind, I don't have time for this. I need to get this back to Bog. And Trevor goes, you know how hard it was to get this thing. And Ferris asks what Trevor's even doing here, and Trevor says he's here to help him. And he says he's got and Ferris says, I've got news for you. Ferris tucks the droid under his arm. You're not helping. And that's when Trevor spots some droids darting through the air and pushes Ferris to the ground. As the droids and then Ferris sees droids darting through the air, going straight for him, and that's where we end off the chapter. Not really a whole lot to talk about here, but you know, you got Trevor, who is again still a bit nervous, but yeah, he's doing well for himself, really, isn't he? But it's going to be interesting to see how those interactions between Ferris and Trevor continue. You know, and it's because he's quite angry at Trevor here. You know, he almost killed Trevor because he didn't know it was Trevor, and it's you know, that may have just been the point to push him to the dark side if that happened. So it's gonna be interesting to see also how Ferris takes care of Trevor while also being a double agent. You know, because there's no way the Empire's going to allow him to have this kid with him wherever he goes. You know, so it's going to be interesting to see where that goes. Again, literally there's not a whole lot to talk about in this chapter. It's going to be. I assume the droids that were darting for Ferris are the same micro droids, the micro technology droids that we were told about in what was it earlier in the book? What I think chapter 4. So yeah. But yeah, that'll do it for this review, I think. So thank you all for watching, and goodbye. Hello, I have just read chapter 14 of The Last of the Jedi Return of the Dark Side. Yeah, 14. So Ferris pushes Trevor under a heavy speeder, and he gets ready to fight the Russian droids, but he stops for a moment and lets them open fire, and the blast. And as he was thinking back and thinking they had incredible accuracy earlier that had been aimed at the fleeing speeder, and he was sure that they'd hit it several times, and he waited for a moment, and he backs up, leaps onto the roof of a speeder, and red beams of energy fly towards him, and Trevor is alarmed, of course, and it says it passes over him, so I assume it hits him, and it's harmless, just as he'd suspected. And Ferris puts Bog's droid on top of the speeder, jumps down, and the droids circle and come back. And Ferris catches some, and he catches some in each hand, and Trevor goes, wow! And Ferris turns the droids over in his hands and inspects the weapons display. And Trevor is curious as to what he's doing, and Trevor explains that the blast of fire was benign, harmless. And he's saying that there was no charge, and he's wondering why. And he then realises they locked onto Bog's personal droid. and he thinks back to when Trevor stole the petty, and he realizes, hold on, those droids were already moving to the droid, were already moving towards Bog, well, technically Bog's droid, when Trevor stole the droid. And he was wondering what for. And he stands and puts the two Russian droids in his pocket, and and he says that he has to get back. And Trevor wonders, and that's when they get to the airspeeder. Ferris tells him, you're going to have to hide in the cargo hold. And Trevor is, of course, Trevor is about to protest, and Ferris says to just do it and don't say a word, he'll explain later. And they get back to the residence tower. And they see lots of stormtroopers, rings on the platform, the Russian delegation's gone, and there's lots of reporters, and the lead, what was it? Hold on, what was it? It was something like the lead communications officer. And Trevor's going, maybe you want to rethink this approach. And Ferris reminds him that it's okay, he's one of them at the moment. They think he's one of them. And Ferris brings the vehicle down, and Bog comes over, and he says, you got it back. Who took it? And Ferris explains that it's just a common street thief looking to sell it on the black market. And Bog says, where is the Womp Rat in custody? He's like to fry him up for breakfast. And Trevor gives a little squeak. And luckily Bog doesn't hear it. And Ferris says that he's not in custody, and he dropped the droid, and he caught it and came back here. And he says, I guess he realised it was a stupid idea. And that's when Bog starts his manipulations and says, did you have any trouble getting back here? And Ferris says no, and he sees there's a flash of relief on Bog's face. And he perches the droid back on his shoulder, and he said, I thought coming here to speak to the delegation would make a difference. Bridge the gap. He shook his head. I never expected they'd have the nerve to assassinate me. And Ferris is just going, what? Because again, he was there. And he says, those droids in the air, we ran a security check on them. The attack, they were Roshan. We ran a security droid on them during the attack. They were Roshan. There was blaster fire coming from them straight at me. Luckily, I have good reflexes. I was like, oh, Bog, you're such a fool. And Ferris says, no, that was from the stormtroopers, and they were firing at the airspeeder. Bog's saying, you can't know that. And Ferris says, I was standing only a few meters away. And he has the Russian droids in his pocket, and of course, Ferris has the Russian droids in his pocket, but he knows they can't prove anything, and he knows if he hands them over, it would just confirm their existence and give more credibility to Bog's lie. And this is what Ferris understood. They weren't harmless, they were intended to be harmless shots as a setup. So it would look like, because they're coming from Russian droids, this is why he got the Russian Prowler droids. It was to make it look like the Russians tried to assassinate Bog. And then even do it, in real time. And have them, of course, fire at the droid so they could kind of fire at him. And it was only that Trevor stole the droid that it happened to reveal the little ploy he was doing. But now he knows he can't. But Ferris knows he can't. But this is when it says, but Bog had turned the incident to his advantage. He would claim that the thief was part of the Roshan plot. Ferris was trapped. He couldn't expose Bog without exposing Trevor. and Bog leans towards him with what's described as a look with a gaze empty of intelligence but full of menace. And Ferrus isn't intimidated, but he did see that if he interfered what Bog was planning, that Bog wouldn't take it lightly. And Bog says, "Since there is no way for you to really have seen it, I hope you keep your mistaken impressions to yourself," he says. "You think that because the Emperor has given you amnesty, that he can't revoke that order at any time? The Emperor came to my planet, to my ceremony. Who do you think he's going to believe?" "Your planet," Ferrus said. "Since when?" "Just don't get in my way," Bog warned. And Ferrus watches as Bog goes back to the reporters. Again, he's just going to lie to them about the assassination. And Ferrus starts to get a bad feeling, and he knows Bog has overestimated his importance to the Emperor, and knows the Emperor just views him as a tool. But Ferrus knows the Emperor also views him as a tool, and he just thinks, trapped. But this time he uses he signs out the residence tower with the airspeeder, and once they were safely away, Trevor's able to come out, and they come to the Twilight Fountains. And Trevor is immediately begins moaning, saying, "I can't believe you took the droid back. I went through a lot of trouble to get to seal it." And Ferrus says that it was a stupid idea, and if he wants to help the Resistance, he has to get into contact with them Force first. Trevor says Flame thought they wouldn't take her seriously if she didn't put off some kind of mission first. And Ferrus asks who Flame is, and Ferrus explains who she is. She is, and says that she was a contact at Thomas, and that she's intending to build up to make a network, etc., etc. You already know about this. And Ferrus says, so Thomas set up this meeting? He sent you? Ferrus knew Trevor well by now. He saw the lie begin to form on the boy's face. "Thomas didn't send you, you came by yourself." "Well, they weren't about to consider me. It was too dangerous for any of them. So you took the ship," Trevor mumbled, "and came here." "So you left them without a ship?" "So, they didn't have one before." And Ferrus asks where the ship is. Trevor explains it's in the Crystal Forest, and then Ferrus says that once they've finished here, he wants him to get back there, take the ship, and go back to the base. And that's Trevor says, "Yes, sir, General Ferrus One, sir. Except for one thing. There's no more ship." Ferrus closes his eyes and goes, "No more ship." And Trevor explains he crashed it. And Ferrus asks, Ferrus doesn't want to believe it, but he could. And he asks if anyone saw him, and Trevor explains that a couple of stormtroopers saw him, but he got away in Flame's speeder, and says it was one incredible ride. And she says, and this idea of central funding of resistance groups, she's got all these plans to mobilise and find other investors. We've got to bring her to the resistance here so they can join Moonstrike. And Ferrus says he's not bringing her to the resistance. And Trevor asks why, and Ferrus says that she could be anyone. And Ferrus says, "What are you talking about? Toma contacted her." And Ferrus says, "What you told me was that she contacted Toma. He doesn't know if she's for real either. I can't endanger the resistance by bringing a stranger to them." And Trevor keeps on refusing, saying that she's not a stranger, and Ferrus says she'll bring her message to the resistance, and that is all. And he asks if he told her about the secret base, and Trevor says, of course not, he wouldn't do that. But she thinks they could help because they really need supplies there. Raina and Toma are really struggling there, and she could fund the base, and it could be more than just a little hideout for Jedi. And Ferrus is just shaking his head through Trevor's proposition. and says that if the base is to succeed, it needs to be small, and there needs to be as few people who know about it. And the more people that know about it, the worse. The less people that know about it, the better. And says even if Flame checks out, I don't want to link the base to a galaxy-wide resistance movement. Not yet, anyway. And Trevor says, well, that's the only way we're going to defeat the Empire. And Ferris says that he knows that, but he also knows that moving prematurely will endanger all of them. And he created the base in order to gather Jedi, and he says, period. If we get too ambitious, we could risk everything. The base must remain a secret. And that's when Trevor starts striking some nerves and says, you got some weird, wacky Jedi obsession. That's your problem. They kicked you out, so now you have to prove you're worthy or something. Ferris says, they didn't kick me out. I left, and this search has nothing to do with me. It has to do with saving anything that might be left. An alliance of resistance groups is necessary, I agree, but I'm beginning to understand this. In the end, only the Force will defeat the Emperor. And Ferris is struggling with his own annoyance at what Trevor had said. And he knows, and Obi-Wan had tried to tell him that only the Force will defeat the Emperor, and he hasn't been ready to listen at that moment. And he's wondering what Obi-Wan was waiting for on Tatooine. He thought maybe it was something abstract, hoping for something to happen, but he starts to realise that he wasn't hoping for something to happen. He was waiting for something to happen, and he just doesn't quite know what. And of course, that was the point. He wasn't meant to know, and that wasn't for him to know. But as Obi-Wan can't tell him, but he knows that somehow Obi-Wan has hope. And Trevor says that he knows how the Force works and how it is this wonderful, incredible thing, but it's not everything. And it says it's just part of what can bring them down. You aren't giving Flame a chance. And Ferris says that he will give her a chance, but not with the base. And he says he'll bring her message to the Resistance. And Trevor asks to come with him, and Ferris says, no, you know how resistances work. The fewer people that know who are in them, the better. And Trevor says, you don't trust me. And Ferris says, of course he trusts him, but this is the best way. And he says, you know that, and he says, of course I trust you, but this is the best way, Trevor. Now let me figure out how to get you to another ship. You've got to get off planet. There might be an Imperial crackdown on air traffic very soon. You're lucky you weren't blasted out of the sky. And Trevor again hits another nerve, saying, is this how you were like as a Jedi Padawan? No wonder no one likes you. And Ferris stops for a moment, and as much as he wants to control this conversation, he knows he can't. And he knows he has to stop underestimating Trevor, and he knows Trevor's right as well. He knows that this is how Ferris was like as a Padawan. And he knows he has to stop treating Trevor like a child, because Siri would have known that, Obi-Wan would have known that, and Trevor has been through so much, despite his age. And Ferris admits that he was like that as a Padawan, and he says he'll contact the Resistance and tell them about you, and he says he can tell them what he knows about Flame. And they can make a decision on whether to meet with her. And he says, fair enough. And Trevor, who is still quite serious, says, fair enough. And that's when Trevor sees comlink signals. And he looks at it and says that he's being wanted back at Imperial headquarters. And he hates having to leave things like this with Trevor. And he says, I have to go. And Trevor says, oh, is the Emperor calling you? Trevor asked in a singing tone. Ready to do his bidding? You know why I'm doing this, Ferris said. Trevor looked at him, his expression clouded with disappointment. Not really. I know this, though. If you get that close to evil, it can rub off on you. Ferris walked away towards the speeder. He had no answer to give to Trevor, because deep in his heart, he suspected that Trevor was right. And that's how we end off the chapter. I was talking about how in last review how it would be interesting to see how the conflict between Ferris and Trevor will occur, and there's quite a bit in this chapter to talk about. Like Bog's manipulations. That's quite interesting, and it's and he's kind of cornered Ferris now. He can't expose everything now. It's gonna be so. Yeah, it's gonna be interesting to see how Trevor finds his way to the Resistance. Unless Ferris gets into contact with them first and then goes to Imperial headquarters. We also get to kind of see how Ferris. He trusts Ferris, but he doesn't have a ton of faith in Ferris. He's seeing him for his age rather than who he is, and you see that with how he's treating Trevor, and it's even stated pretty much as much in the book. In other words, and he knows that Trevor can handle himself. He just sometimes needs a little bit of guidance. And he's starting to realise that. But he's also being reasonable. He's still being reasonable. A lot of what he said is reasonable. He knows how the fewer the people know about Resistances, the better. He's being reasonable there, and it did bring up that question of how do we know this flame is real? How do we know this is the real flame? And that's actually quite an interesting thing to bring up, because it's, how do we know this isn't a real flame? So, that was quite interesting to be brought back up. And it does start to lead, and I do wonder if it does actually bring up that question of, is this the real flame? Is this the flame we know? Is this the flame that we know of, or no? So it's going to be interesting to see if Flame does wind up being an imposter or not. And again, I do like that conflict between Ferris and Trevor. It's something that's happened. We've seen this kind of conflict before, Trevor being underestimated by Ferris just because he's 13, Ferris keeps seeing him as a kid when Trevor has grown up too fast. He's not 13. He is an adult in a 13-year-old's body, with a few 13-year-old things still lingering around, which is what he needs when he needs guidance. That's the kind of thing that Trevor has going on. And Ferris, he's come to realise it quite a few times, and I think this might just be the time where he fully realises it and needs to let Trevor start doing his own thing. So that's going to be interesting to see how that goes. But again, you see Trevor's scribbleness as well. Trevor keeps looking at a small part of the picture. Ferris keeps looking at the bigger picture. Trevor just took it for granted that this was Flame, whereas Ferris knows that this might not be Flame. So, it's going to be... This provokes quite a lot of questions, and it is a very good chapter for both Ferris and Trevor, and it's one of those chapters where it's tough to put into words, and it's one of those chapters where you kind of have to read it yourself. You kind of have to read it yourself to understand what's fully going on. It's one of those things where I'm struggling to put it into words. It's just such a good chapter. It is such a good chapter. I can't remember what... I know I said there was... I think it was in either... Was it in Death on the Boo or the last book where I say it was one of the best chapters in the series. But, maybe... I think this one might just be joining that with one of the best chapters in the series. And I can't remember which chapter specifically it was, or what scene it was in Death on the Boo or The Tangled Web. I can't remember which one of those books it was in. I know it was in those... I think it was in those. It may have been in Underworld, but anyway, you know, I think this chapter 14 probably does join that chapter among some of the best ones in Last of the Jedi, because it is just such a good chapter. It is such a good chapter. And you really just get to see how Trevor... You just really get to see that dynamic between Ferris and Trevor. Again, it's not too much new, you know, per se. It's not anything new, like Ferris and Trevor, you know, they're still in conflict about how Trevor can manage himself, how Trevor is older than he is, while Ferris keeps looking at him as younger than what Trevor's maturity, you know. So it is one of those chapters that we have seen like a million times already, but it's done in such a way here where it feels fresh, and I think it's because of the entire moments that's been going on, you know. Ferris has just come off the back of having to help the Resistance by getting the droid back. Trevor thinks he was helping the Resistance by taking the droid away. And so there's that conflict going on there. Ferris is frustrated, Trevor is frustrated. And that really adds up to make this chapter quite interesting and different from those other chapters, you know. Trevor's not getting frustrated because he's being denied, he's already frustrated. And now he's getting even more frustrated from being denied, and Ferris is already frustrated. And he's trying to be the mature parental guardian figure for Trevor. But Trevor also knows a little bit better. You know, Trevor knows his capabilities, and Ferris doesn't fully know Trevor's capabilities. And so this is a really interesting chapter the more you look into it. So, yeah, again, I think this is one of those times where it's just, you can even just pick up the book for this one chapter, you know, it is just such a good chapter. And also Bog Davinian with his warning as well, you know, how to keep out of his way, and how Ferris can't really do anything. He can't without putting Trevor at risk, you know. So yeah. Looking a bit ahead, it's going to be interesting to see how Trevor gets over to the Resistance unless Ferris, you know, spends a little bit of time getting into contact with them, saying, hey, there's this blue-haired kid named Trevor Flume who wants to talk to you about a woman named Flame. So yeah, it's going to be interesting to see how Trevor gets there. It's going to be interesting to see what happens to the Russian delegation. And Bog Davinian, you know. And it's gonna be interesting to see what the next step is. What the next step is for Ferris, why he's being called back. So yeah, the next chapter does seem to start off with Darth Vader. It does say Darth Vader wanted to avoid this particular discussion with his master. So that does seem like it's going to be a chapter with Vader and Palpatine, maybe even Ferris comes in. So, yeah. That brings an end to this review, I think. It was such a good chapter. Such a good chapter. That's one of the great things with doing these reviews, you know. Sometimes if I miss something in the chapter, I can skim through the chapter and I find something that I missed. And it also allows me to reflect on these chapters a little bit more. So, yeah. Anyway, thank you all for watching, and goodbye. Hello everyone, I have just read chapter 15 of The Last of the Jedi Return of the Dark Side. I'm really reading through this so fast, I've had to go through the, I've had to skim through each chapter again and look at the start of the chapter to remind myself what happens in each chapter. In which chapters which stuff happened, because I was just skimming. I've been going through this so fast. You know, I only started it 2 days ago, and I'm almost finished with it. You know, I've only got what was it, 135 pages. I'm at 111 now, so I'm almost done with the book. The thing is, I have very little to do, and so I just gotta be reading this, and I have the energy to. But anyway, that's a bit enough. That's a bit enough of gossip, isn't it? So, Vader is getting a call from his master, and he speaks with Palpatine, and Palpatine says he's received a report about an assassination attempt on Bog's life. And Vader says he's doubtful and has received contradictory reports. He says Davinian wants to be a hero and is blaming the Russians. And Palpatine says, I am starting to be impressed by our Bog. And Vader says he wants to rule Somalia, he wants real power. Palpatine moves the conversation to Ferrous Olin, saying his personal droid was retrieved by him. And Vader says he's requested a full report from him, and Vader says that his stormtroopers went after the thief, but it was Olin who was successful. Vader's thinking this is exactly why he didn't want to have this conversation, and he changes the subject to the Russians, and he says that that Russian droids were spotted as well, and he thinks they were set off by Davinian. Palpatine goes, interesting. And Vader says that with the assassination attempt, his support with the Sathans is greater than ever, and they'll think Larko is a fool for trusting the Russians. And Palpatine says that's a good sign, and Vader asks if his presence here is required any longer. And Palpatine says that he must remain until Bog is elected for certain, and he wants an Imperial governor in every capital city. And Vader tells him that Davinian will be elected just as he planned. Palpatine says, in the meantime, he senses Ferrous Olin's power growing, and he senses uncertainty in him. And Vader asks if he'll join us, and Palpatine smiles and says, he will become one of us. And the hologram fades, and the last few lines are, no, not Ferrous Olin. It was time to get rid of him. Olin was a reminder of his past, meaning Vader. His past was dead. Olin must follow. So is Vader going to kill Olin in the next chapter? Because it does focus on the M2. I had a little look. It's going to be interesting to see where this leads. Again, I've been reading it so fast, I've been struggling to keep up with it. This is almost as bad as when I was reading The Tale of IG-88, Therefore I Am. I read like 2 chapters a day, and then got to about chapter 4 and I just read the rest of the chapters. I didn't do a video on that, I didn't do reviews on the chapter for that, but on the chapters for that story, so unfortunately you can't watch my reviews for that, but I went straight from chapter 4 to the last chapter 12 in one day, just because I was enjoying that book so much. That story, sorry. And I've been doing the same with this, almost towards the end. Oh wait, I've only got 2 more chapters to go! I just realised. Oh, again, almost lost my bookmark. Oh my god, I didn't realise I've only got 3 chapters to go. I've got chapter 16, 17 and then 18 and I'm done. I did not realise that. But anyway, it's going to be interesting to see what Vader does with Ferrous in the next chapter. And you really just see how infuriated he is by Ferrous. It's not... Again, I think we all know that Vader's a little bit jealous. He keeps telling himself he's not jealous, he's outgrown that jealousy. But I think we all know that deep down he is a little bit jealous. I think we know that. He definitely is jealous deep down. And even though he keeps denying it, I think we all know that he is. So it's going to be interesting to see how that interaction between them two will go in the next chapter, which I think I'm going to read now. So, thank you all for watching, and goodbye. Hello everyone! So I've just read chapter 16 and The Last of the Jedi Return of the Dark Side. I've just gone way too far back. Give me a moment, bear with, there we go. So we finally learn why the Empire wants to control Somalia and Moshe, but we'll get to that. So Vader's brought Ferrous into his office and he tasks him with finding the thief. And
Ferris is taken aback, and he says, but the droid has been returned, and Vader says the thief was involved in the assassination attempt. Also, before that, he gives him the task. He says, Ferris says he takes orders from the Emperor, and Vader lies and says the Emperor has commanded him. And he says you can check with him if you like, and he assumed Ferris wouldn't, and even if he did, he could tell his master he could tell his master that he had told him to help Bog Davinian before the he could tell his master it says, and even if he did, his master had told him to help Bog Davinian before the vote. He could always claim that this was his intent. Anyway, he wants him to find the thief. Ferris says, but the assassination was made up, just to make Bog look like a hero. And Vader says that's all the more reason to find the thief, because if someone appears who can denounce Davinian, it could influence the vote. And Ferris says he can't find him again, he didn't see much of them. And Vader says he's sure he will be able to. Otherwise, he will institute Order 37 and institute mass arrests. And he tells him that there's a battalion in orbit around the Lamurtu system. And he sees Ferris look uneasy, and Ferris says he thinks this is a bad idea, and Vader's not interested in his opinion. And Ferris leaves, and Vader savours that small victory. It wasn't a lot, but it was tasty enough to savour. And as Ferris is making his way through the corridor, through the hallway, he's thinking he can't turn Trevor in. But he has no doubt that Vader will follow through on his threat. And he knows there's only a few hours until the vote of no confidence happens in the Minister's Hall. And he knows it's time for the Resistance to expose Bog. And he thinks at the very least it will serve as a distraction. And his heart starts to quicken, and he knows there's something different. Usually there's a lot of indistinct sound, but he starts to realise there's a lot more activity than usual. And he sees a nervous-looking junior officer heading down the hall, and he uses the Force to listen in on this conversation, and that's where he learns that Order 37 is going to be instituted. And he's saying, the troops are mobilised and ready for its order. Yes, sir. Garrison has been shifted to Order 37. Delegation is making plans to depart, but they are still quartered in the tower. Of course, Ferris knows Order 37 from his time on Balasa in the Desperate Mission, where they wanted him to hand over Ferris Solon or all the prisoners would die. And I'm fairly sure that's what it was, if I'm remembering correctly. And Ferris starts to heads for the exit, and his heart's pounding. Vader has lied to him. He's already given the order to his battalion, and they're standing by. But he's wondering who they are targeting, because Order 37's only ever done with a target. Now, Ferris has little doubt that the Russian delegation will only be the first victims. He goes back to the cantina and finds Dinko, Neck and Firefolk talking to Trevor and Flame. So they somehow found their way there. And he nods at Flame. I guess it is the real Flame. And she says a lot about him. And Ferris says that the Imperial Battalion's on alert. And Dinko asks, is it for what, invasion? Ferris says that yes, and he assumes they're in reserve in case Bog isn't elected, and anyone who protests will find themselves in an Imperial jail. And next it says it's what they feared, it's happening what they feared for so long. Flame asks if there's anything they can do to stop it. And that's when Ferris brings up there's something they're missing. He's wondering what the Empire has against Rosha. Why do they want to stop the trade agreement? And he says they're willing to invade a planet that isn't even hostile to them. And Dinko explains that they've had a rivalry with the Rosha, but they realise they can benefit from each other. Before Bog started spreading the lies, the diplomacy was working. And that's when Ferris removes the two Russian droids, and Firefolk starts to inspect them. And he's in awe of them. And he starts to tinker about with them. And he says that he's a systems designer and this is a whole new technology for him to learn. And he says he's never seen one of these and it's illegal to import them, which of course is something we know. And Ferris says that Largo had told him that the Russians are experts in microtechnology. And Firefolk says that yes, that is the case. It was part of their rivalry because it was based on fear that their droids could invade their systems because of how small they are. And he says, would you look at this? A universal receiver microchip and a remote sensory plug-in with amazing range. I heard a rumour they'd developed this stuff, but what is it? They can transfer information from any mainframe without a plug-in. This is an amazing delivery system. They can do it from distances, from the air. Firefolk took out its starter pad and began to run tests on the droid. It's got a direct system pathway to the photoreceptors and the movement sensors, so I'm guessing this is a way for the droid to read another droid's programming, so it can avoid collision, stay, or duplication. All in less than a second. On a world with heavy droid use like Rosha, it would be a necessity. Their droids fly, ours just hover, so in less than a second they can single out what they need to know. The other droid's path, for example, so they can make a counter move. I've seen versions of this, but this is way beyond. Technically, it's highly sophisticated. And Ferris pretty much asks for the simplest explanation, and says, "You mean they read the other droid's programming and analyse it?" And Firefolk says that they don't read it, they duplicate it and transfer it into their own system, analyse what they need, and then dump it. And Ferris asks, then can't they steal the information? And Firefolk says that no, because of how small they are, they don't have the capacity to retain the information. They analyse some of it, the most important bits, so I guess. It says, he says, not really, it has to be... I see where you're going with this. Firefolk says, not really, it has to be garbaged out. A droid this size doesn't have near the capacity to hold on to that much information. It can receive it, but it can only process a bit of it. If the droid kept all that information, it would overload and self-destruct. Ferris starts to feel a bit of excitement, and he says, but here in South they've pioneered the delivery of vast amounts of information from a BRT to a personal droid. And Dinko says that yes, it's loaded on from mainframes that they have at home or at businesses they frequent, and they have what they call a safeguard passageways to avoid overloading the droid. And that's when Ferris says, what if they put the technology of both droids together? He starts saying now, the Russian droids have the ability to pull information from another droid, the Samarian droids have the ability to hook up to a vast BRT system. And he says, what if you built a super droid that could grab enormous amounts of information without a plug-in? And says, what if the droids could scramble the information and then send it to a second droid? And Firefolk sits still for a minute and says, you mean pass the random information from a BRT to another droid? It would have to be super fast. It's possible in theory, but that means a vast amount of information will be passed back. And Zinko says that if they marry their BRT system software with the droid system software, Next then intervenes and says that but use the hardware of their PDs, they can target any droid and plus a flood of information to it. And Firefolk ends it saying, and they could overload that targeted droid. In other words, I assume it's just give the information, have I guess the memory capacity the analysing and duplicating ability of this droid into another droid. And Flame lets out a breath saying like a commander battle droid, and then Trevor asks, or any Imperial droid. And Firefolk says, who's actually on this page 117 mistakenly referred to as Firefox, the browser. And he says, unbelievable, but possible. And Ferris realises that's why the Emperor doesn't want a trade agreement between Samaria and Rosha, because if they put their technology together, they're a real danger. They can disable any of their droids by overloading them. And they could knock out their surveillance droids, and maybe even knock out the Stormtrooper communications system, and everything they depend on for keeping the galaxy under their control would just be able to be knocked out by their directed information they think, and so next says, just with our personal joys, just by being able to transfer too much information. And Trevor says, how do you like that? Buy a cup of tea, annihilate an army, all in a droid's day's work. And Trevor says, if you export your systems and make it galaxy-wide, you have the key to a galaxy-wide resistance. And that's when Flame says it's the key to a galaxy-wide resistance. Moonstrike could fund it. And Ferris says, wait a second, remember, we're not the first to put this together. That's why they want to control Samaria. So they can move on to Vosha too, and control both their worlds and stop any information exchange before it starts. And he doesn't know whether Davinian's in on it or not, but but Ferris doubts Davinian is on it. And he says he's not high up enough, and they don't value him enough. But he knows that he's playing right into their plan. And he's saying they'll arrest the Russian delegation and imprison them, and they can't let them get back to Vosha, as they've already had meetings with the technicians on Samaria, and I assume it's going to be because they're thinking about putting their technologies together, and sooner or later they're going to find out about how they can overload their systems and stuff. And Firefolk wonders what they need to do now. And Ferris says they need to bring the idea to the Russian delegation and get them off planet. And he says the Empire is monitoring all departures and getting them out will be tricky. And of course they can't leave from Saf, they'll need their own ship. They can't use their own ship. And Flame says that she has a ship. Of course, she has a ship in the Crystal Forest. She can use the Crystal Forest, and she says that she can do it and get them home. Ferris nods and says, in the meantime, the Resistance needs to, of course, influence the no confidence vote and expose Bog. And he says now is the time because the vote is scheduled to take place in less than an hour. And Ferris says that he'll go with Flame and Trevor to smuggle out the Russian delegation, and Dinko says he, Neck and Firefolk will head for the Hall of Ministers to expose Bog. And Dinko, Neck and Firefolk all leave. Ferris looks at Trevor and says that he's only got one more problem, and he's hoping Vader will be too busy to care about his little Order 37, but he knows he's an evil mastermind and he's a great multitasker. And Ferris looks at Trevor affectionately, and he smiles at his earnest expression, and he says, "You." Oh, this is like the moments in High Potential where it all suddenly clicks for Morgan. You have the music going on, and it just all suddenly clicks, and she knows who it is. This is what this moment feels like. And funnily enough, I actually just watched the latest episode of High Potential, which was The Force and the Furious, or was it the... How do you pronounce that? Forced? F-A-U-S-T. Okay, it's not Forced, it's Faust. The Faust and the Furious. I just watched that episode not so long ago, so that's quite ironic. This is actually a really moment where it's like, oh, and it's also really like a High Potential episode because they leave just enough information out of your grasp so you can't get the full picture until they tell you. So this is really like High Potential. Okay, it's the other way around. High Potential's like this chapter, but from my perspective, it's the other way around. This is a really good chapter, and it all just suddenly clicks. And of course, we know that technology doesn't get out, the overloading technology. But it would be that would be a really great thing for like a couple of stories in Star Wars. Having like a Samarian or Russian, having a put droids there, like a technician, having a droid, maybe they're in the rebellion or something, or in a resistance, and they've got that crossover technology thing going on. That would be a really good story, and having them disabling systems, etc. That would be a really good concept for like a Star Wars character. And I'm surprised that we haven't really had that. You never know, maybe we will. But oh, there is, and I just haven't read far enough into this. But I'm fairly sure that doesn't happen. Otherwise I think it would be one of those things that would be a prominent thing in Star Wars, and it isn't. But this is a really genius thing, and it really was a oh moment. And it really just is one of those things that just clicks and you're impressed. So yeah, this is one of those moments where I cannot believe it, but it is. It really just is. So that was such a good moment. Also you got Vader wanting Ferris to find Trevor, but I don't think, and I think that is a bit of a moment as well. But you got Order 37. There's so much in this chapter, and it's, again, I think this may have to go up there with I think, what was it, last chapter I said that was really great. Yeah, that was the chapter with no, not last chapter, the chapter before, sorry, with Ferris having that conversation with Trevor. I think this might just have to go up there as one of the best chapters in Last of the Jedi. This was such a great chapter, because it all just immediately clicked, and even though it's a bit complicated to follow, it's still it's still basic enough to understand what they're going on about. They're saying it pretty much is just they have the Russian droids don't have the capacity, the memory capacity to have the to store onto the massive amounts of information, where they can analyze and duplicate another droid's mind. And the Saturn technology, they're able to contain a lot of information from a BRT computer droid which runs a whole city. And so if they combine the technology of the two, they can overload the droids. They can overload any droids by pushing information into them. That's pretty much how it works, I assume. And so this was just a really good chapter. It really, really was. And again, I can't believe I've only got 2 more chapters left after this. I cannot believe that. Because again, I only started it 2 days ago. I started it on the... it's the 4th now, so I only started it on the 2nd of February. It's the 4th of February. I'm almost finished with this book. Oh. Again, that just goes to show how much time I've had and how much I've been enjoying this book. So yeah, I'm really looking forward to seeing where this goes. So yeah. Oh, this was such a good chapter. It was such a good chapter. So yeah. I don't really have anything else to say. I do wonder actually, if Vader knows Ferris knew the thief. I do wonder if he suspects Ferris had something to do with the assassination attempt and the thief. Because, again, he wants to get rid of Ferris himself. He even says in the last chapter, Ferris has got to go. So it's going to be interesting to see if he's like seeing Ferris uneasy and a bit unwilling to do it. And so it's gonna be interesting to see if he knows Ferris won't come through, and that will give him the reason to kill him, If he wants to try and disgrace Ferris in the eyes of Palpatine, it's gonna be interesting to see how that goes out. Yeah, I think that ends the review for this chapter. So thank you all for watching, and goodbye.